I sat there, gripping the edge of the table, watching my Aunt Diane smirk like she had just won the lottery. The whole family had gathered in the lawyer's office for the reading of my grandmother's will. We were grieving, but there was something else in the air, tension thick enough to cut with a knife. And at the center of it all? Diane. She had always thought she was the smartest person in the room, always scheming, always manipulating. But today she was practically glowing with self-satisfaction. I should have known something was coming when she insisted on sitting at the head of the table like a queen ruling over her subjects. The lawyer, Mr. Calloway, cleared his throat. "We're here to go over your mother's final wishes." But before he could even continue, Diane leaned forward, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Actually, there is no will." Silence. The entire room stilled. My mom's face paled, my uncle clenched his jaw, and my cousins exchanged confused glances. Even the lawyer arched an eyebrow. My uncle was the first to speak. "What the hell do you mean there's no will?" Diane gave a dramatic sigh like she was speaking to a bunch of clueless children. "I mean exactly what I said. Mom wrote a will, but I found it and I destroyed it." Gasps filled the room. My mom let out a shaky breath, her eyes welling with tears. "You had no right." Diane just shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Since there's no will, everything defaults to the next of kin." She smiled, slow and smug. "Which, in case you forgot, is me." The arrogance. The entitlement. She really thought she had won. She thought she had outplayed everyone. But then Mr. Calloway did something that made Diane's face drop. He smiled. And in that moment I knew she had no idea what was coming. The room was eerily silent, except for the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. My mother sat stiffly beside me, her fingers gripping the hem of her blouse, her face pale. My uncle leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his lips pressed into a tight, angry line. My cousins, scattered around the table, avoided eye contact as if looking at one another would make this nightmare any less real. And then there was Diane, my aunt, sitting at the head of the table like she owned the world. Her expression was one of pure satisfaction, her arms folded across her chest as she leaned back in her chair, oozing smugness. If you didn't know any better, you'd think she was the one hosting this meeting, not our grandmother's lawyer. I had never wanted to slap someone more in my entire life. "There is no will," Diane announced, her voice dripping with triumph. Silence. My mother inhaled sharply. My uncle, who had been barely keeping it together, clenched his jaw so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. Mr. Calloway, my grandmother's longtime attorney, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He simply observed. "What did you just say?" my uncle finally asked, his voice low, dangerous. Diane let out an exaggerated sigh, like she was talking to a room full of kindergartners. "I said there is no will." She shrugged, her smile widening. "Grandma wrote one, sure. But I found it, and I destroyed it." The air in the room changed instantly. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. One of my cousins let out an audible gasp. Even my uncle, who had always been the calm, level-headed one, looked like he might actually jump across the table. I, however, stayed completely still. Because something about this wasn't adding up. Diane had always been manipulative, always found ways to twist situations in her favor. Growing up, she was the one who borrowed money and never returned it, the one who threw tantrums until she got her way. But this was next level bold even for her. She had just admitted in front of a lawyer that she had destroyed a legal document. I glanced at Mr. Calloway, expecting him to react, to tell her she was making a huge mistake, but he didn't move. If anything, there was an odd glint in his eye. Diane, oblivious, continued. "So, with no will, that means everything automatically passes to the next of kin." She placed a perfectly manicured hand on her chest. "Me?" My mother's voice trembled. "That's not true." Diane smirked. "It absolutely is. Since Grandma lived with me for the last few years of her life, and I was her primary caretaker, legally all of her assets fall to me. The house, her savings, her stocks, everything." I could feel the rage boiling beneath my skin. Grandma had been clear about what she wanted. She had told all of us multiple times. The house was to be split between my mother and uncle. Her savings were to be divided equally among the grandchildren. She had sentimental items, her jewelry, her antique furniture, even her wedding ring, that were meant for specific people. She had taken the time to plan everything down to the last detail. And Diane had wiped it all away with one selfish decision. That's not what she wanted, my mother said, voice shaking. Well, Diane said, leaning forward, resting her elbows on the table, it doesn't really matter what she wanted, does it? Because she didn't secure it properly. And now it's gone. She let the words hang in the air for a moment, enjoying our stunned silence before reaching for the glass of water in front of her. She took a slow sip, like she was savoring the taste of victory. That was when I saw it, the tiniest flicker of amusement cross Mr. Calloway's face. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. And suddenly I understood. Diane thought she had won. She thought she had outsmarted all of us, that she had successfully erased Grandma's wishes and walked away with everything. But she was wrong. So wrong. Mr. Calloway cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Actually, he said, flipping open the folder in front of him, your mother was quite thorough. Diane's smirk twitched. What? Mr. Calloway reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, unassuming USB drive. He set it down gently on the table, right in front of Diane. The energy in the room shifted instantly. My mother sat up straighter. My uncle's frown deepened. Even my cousins, who had been silent this whole time, leaned in, watching closely. This, Mr. Calloway continued, tapping the USB drive, is your mother's video will. Diane's face went from victorious to pale in a matter of seconds. Her mouth opened, then closed, like she was trying to form a sentence but couldn't quite get the words out. Mr. Calloway cut her off. It was recorded in the presence of 2 neutral witnesses, signed and legally notarized. Which means, he leaned back in his chair, the faintest hint of a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. Your little stunt means absolutely nothing. Diane went completely still. I watched as her expression crumbled, the realization sinking in. She thought she had destroyed the only will that existed. She thought she had stolen everything. But Grandma had been one step ahead of her all along. Diane sat frozen, her smirk completely gone. It was almost funny how fast the color drained from her face. The confidence, the arrogance, it all vanished in an instant. The rest of the room was just as stunned. My mother, who had been on the verge of tears just moments ago, now looked almost hopeful. My uncle, who had been seconds away from flipping the table, let out a slow breath, his grip on the chair loosening. My cousins, who had sat in stunned silence this whole time, suddenly perked up, their eyes flickering with curiosity. No one said a word. Diane, however, was the first to break. She let out a sharp, forced laugh. A video will? Her voice cracked at the end, betraying her attempt at nonchalance. That's ridiculous. Mr. Calloway didn't react. He simply picked up the USB drive and turned toward his laptop. We'll see. He plugged it in, and after a few clicks, the screen came to life. And there she was, Grandma, sitting in her favorite chair, wearing the soft blue sweater she always loved, her hair neatly pinned back the way she always did when she wanted to feel put together. She looked straight into the camera, her expression firm, no nonsense, the way it always was when she meant business. If you're watching this, Grandma began, her voice steady, then my daughter Diane has probably tried some nonsense. A stunned silence fell over the room. Diane flinched like she had been slapped. My uncle let out a breathy, disbelieving chuckle. One of my cousins actually snorted. I just sat back in my chair, my lips curling into the smallest smirk. Grandma knew. Had known all along. I made this video, Grandma continued, because I know my daughter. I know she thinks she's the smartest person in the room. And I know she believes she can take whatever she wants without consequences. Diane shifted uncomfortably, her hands clenching into fists. Well, Grandma said, tilting her head slightly, she's wrong. Mr. Calloway paused the video and turned to Diane. Would you like me to continue? Diane's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Please, my uncle said, leaning forward, do go on. With a satisfied nod, Mr. Calloway pressed play. As for my will, Grandma went on, I have made it very clear how I want my estate divided. My house is to be split equally between my son and my daughter. She gestured off-screen, likely toward my mother and uncle, because they both cared for me when I needed them. My savings are to be distributed equally among my grandchildren. And my personal belongings, she paused, a knowing smile forming on her lips, will go to those who will actually cherish them. Diane sucked in a sharp breath, shaking her head furiously. This isn't real. She was old. She was confused. Confused? Grandma's voice suddenly cut through Diane's outburst, perfectly timed. I know exactly what I'm saying, Diane. I swear my uncle nearly fell out of his chair laughing. Diane, however, looked like she was going to be sick. I made sure this video was signed, notarized, and legally recorded, Grandma went on. And in case my daughter still thinks she can weasel her way out of this, her eyes darkened slightly, let me be clear, if any of my belongings go missing, if any financial transactions occur that I did not authorize, and if anyone, her eyes narrowed slightly, tries to contest this well, let's just say I have already taken measures to ensure the law handles it accordingly. Diane visibly tensed. My mom turned to look at her, realization dawning. Oh my God. What? Uncle stiffened. She stole from her, didn't she? Diane's face went completely pale. I don't know what you're talking about, she snapped. Mr. Calloway calmly pulled out another folder. Actually, he said, flipping it open, your mother was very thorough. He pulled out a thick stack of documents, bank statements, transaction logs, signed complaints. It was all there. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every single dollar Diane had siphoned from Grandma's accounts. Tens of thousands. Gone. My mother covered her mouth in horror. My uncle swore under his breath. My cousins whispered amongst themselves, shock clear on their faces. And Diane? Diane was trembling. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible. No. Yes, Mr. Calloway said simply. And as of this morning, the police have reopened the case. A knock at the door echoed through the room. I swear Diane's soul left her body. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. One of them, a tall, no-nonsense-looking woman, pulled out a notepad and read from it. Diane Reynolds? Diane sat frozen. You're under arrest for financial exploitation, elder abuse, and fraud. Complete and utter chaos. Diane shot up from her chair. This is a mistake. This is all a mistake. One officer stepped forward, pulling out handcuffs. Ma'am, please cooperate. Diane turned to my mom, then my uncle, desperation in her eyes. Please help me. I'm family. You can't let them do this. My uncle leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. You made your bed, Diane. My mother shook her head. You stole from her. I didn't say anything. I just watched. Watched as the officer grabbed Diane's wrists, securing the handcuffs with a cold, satisfying click. Watched as Diane thrashed, screamed, cursed. Watched as they dragged her toward the door, her protests growing more desperate by the second. And then, just as they were about to take her out, she turned back one last time, eyes filled with fury, and shrieked, You'll regret this. You'll all regret this. The officer sighed and muttered, Yeah, tell it to the judge. And just like that, Diane was gone. Mr. Calloway let out a small, satisfied sigh and closed the folder in front of him. Well, he said, adjusting his glasses, that was eventful. The room was quiet for a moment. Then my uncle let out a sharp breath and said, Jesus Christ. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. For the first time since Grandma passed, I actually felt like I could breathe. But I knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Diane was gone, hauled off in cuffs, her screams still echoing in the hallway. For the first time in years, the family wasn't under her thumb. But just as I thought we could finally take a breath, Mr. Calloway cleared his throat and flipped open another folder. There's one more thing, he said. My stomach dropped. My mom, who had barely recovered from watching her sister get arrested, paled. My uncle rubbed his temples, already bracing for whatever fresh nightmare was coming next. Please, my mom whispered, no more surprises. Mr. Calloway sighed, pushing a thick stack of documents toward us. I wish that were the case, but you need to see this. I leaned forward, reading the title printed at the top of the first page. Deed to Property Transfer of Ownership. My uncle squinted at it. What the hell is this? Mr. Calloway's expression was unreadable. This is proof that your grandmother never actually owned her house. The air in the room shifted. What? My mom clutched her chest. That's not possible. She paid for everything. She lived there her entire life. She did, Mr. Calloway agreed. But not on paper. He tapped the documents. Technically, legally, your grandmother never held full ownership of the house. It was still under her parents' name when she lived there, and while she assumed she was paying off her mortgage, the deed was never properly transferred. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. What does that mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Calloway hesitated before delivering the final blow. It means that while we were all focused on Diane's fraud, the bank was finalizing their claim. My uncle's face darkened. Which means what, exactly? Mr. Calloway took a deep breath. It means the house isn't part of the estate. It doesn't belong to you. And if we don't act fast, the bank will take it. Silence. A suffocating, crushing silence. My mom gasped, pressing her hands to her face. My uncle slammed his fist on the table, cursing under his breath. My cousins all exchanged panicked looks. I felt sick. First Diane. Now this. So what do we do? My uncle's voice was sharp, desperate. Mr. Calloway folded his hands. We have two options. The first is to challenge it in court. Gather every document, every receipt your grandmother ever had and fight this. But that could take years and there's no guarantee we'd win. My mom wiped at her eyes, her voice trembling. And the second option? He looked at us carefully. You buy the house back. At market value. My uncle swore again, running a hand down his face. That's not an option. Diane drained 80 grand from Mom's accounts. That was her savings. We don't have that kind of money lying around. A heavy silence fell over the room. And then, as the weight of it all threatened to crush us, something clicked in my head. Wait. I sat up, gripping the edge of the table. What about Diane? Mr. Calloway frowned. What about her? I turned to my mom and uncle, my pulse racing. Diane stole money, right? The police are charging her for it. That means if she's convicted, we can go after her assets. My uncle's eyes widened. Holy, my mom blinked. Are you saying? I nodded. We sue her. We take back every cent she stole. And if she spent it all, she still has her own house, her car, her jewelry, and her retirement fund, Mr. Calloway added. Which, as it turns out, she was funneling money into using your grandmother's accounts. That was it. That was the key. We weren't just going to get justice. We were going to ruin her. My uncle leaned back, a slow grin spreading across his face. So let me get this straight. We're going to use Diane's own stolen money to buy back Grandma's house? Mr. Calloway nodded. If you act fast, yes. My mom exhaled shakily, then let out a watery laugh. Poetic justice. I smirked. Grandma would love this. And she would. Because in the end, Diane didn't just lose. She lost everything. Diane's face had gone pale, and for the first time she looked genuinely afraid. She had always been the one in control, always had a plan, always thought she was the smartest person in the room. But now she was backed into a corner with no way out. I could see it in her eyes. She was scrambling, desperately trying to come up with some excuse, some way to weasel her way out of this. No, this isn't right, she stammered, shaking her head. You can't just believe everything she said. She was old, confused, but before she could even finish that sentence, Mr. Calloway raised a hand, shutting her down. Careful, Diane, he said, his voice calm but laced with warning. That's your mother you're talking about. And as I said, this video was recorded with full legal validation. It's indisputable. Diane's mouth snapped shut, her lips trembling. She turned to my mother, then to my uncle, searching their faces for any sign of sympathy. There was none. My mom, who had spent the past few weeks crying over Grandma's death, suddenly looked stronger than I had ever seen her. My uncle, usually the quiet, reserved one, was staring daggers at Diane, his hands clenched into fists. "You stole from her," my uncle finally spoke, his voice dangerously low. "You stole from your own mother. Lied to us. And you thought you'd get away with it?" Diane let out a weak laugh, but it was forced, almost hysterical. "Oh, come on. We're family. We can figure this out." "No, Diane," my mom cut in sharply. "You don't get to figure this out. You already did. You figured out how to manipulate her, how to take what wasn't yours, how to make sure no one else knew what you were doing." Her voice cracked, but she held her ground. "But she knew. And she stopped you." Diane's breathing was uneven now. Her whole body was trembling as she turned back to Mr. Calloway. "There's got to be something I can do," she pleaded. "A compromise, a deal?" Mr. Calloway didn't even hesitate. "No. The will is final. You get nothing." And just like that, Diane's entire world came crashing down. Diane's breath hitched as the weight of those words settled in. "You get nothing." Her hands balled into fists, her nails digging into her palms so hard I thought she might draw blood. For years, she had gotten away with everything. Stealing from Grandma, controlling her, making herself the center of every family decision. And now she had absolutely nothing. But she wasn't giving up that easily. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, slamming her fists onto the table. "I took care of her. I was the one by her side. I deserve something." My uncle scoffed. "You didn't take care of her, Diane. You controlled her. You isolated her. And now you're paying the price." Diane turned to me, her eyes wild with desperation. "Please," she whispered like I was her last hope. "You don't understand. I didn't mean for this to happen." I leaned forward, staring her down. "Grandma called me Diane. She told me everything." Her face drained of color. "What?" "She told me how you made her feel like a prisoner in her own home. How she wasn't allowed to go anywhere without you. How her money kept disappearing, but every time she asked, you brushed it off." I shook my head. "She was scared of you, Diane." For the first time, real panic flashed in Diane's eyes. She looked around the room, but no one was on her side anymore. My mother was crying, but not from sadness. These were tears of relief, of justice. My uncle looked like he wanted to lunge across the table and throttle her. My cousins were whispering to each other, disbelief on their faces. Then Mr. Calloway cleared his throat. "There's actually more," he said, flipping through another folder. "Your mother suspected you. We're stealing from her long before she made this video will. In fact, she came to me about it." He pulled out another document and slid it across the table. "This is an official police report she filed against you 2 weeks before she passed." Diane froze. The silence was suffocating. My uncle picked up the paper, scanning it quickly, and let out a low, humorless laugh. "Oh my God," he muttered. "You actually thought you could get away with this." Diane shook her head, stumbling back. No, this isn't fair." But before she could say another word, there was a loud knock at the door. And just like that, Diane's fate was sealed. Diane flinched at the sound of the knock, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Her eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal, searching for an escape. But there was none. Mr. Calloway barely looked up as he called out, "Come in." The door swung open and 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside. The air in the room shifted, thick with tension, and I could practically hear Diane's heartbeat pounding in her chest. "Diane Reynolds?" one of the officers asked, his voice calm but firm. Diane's mouth opened, but no words came out. "You are under arrest for financial exploitation, elder abuse, and fraud." A collective gasp rippled through the room. My mother covered her mouth, my uncle let out a short, satisfied breath, and my cousins exchanged shocked glances. But me? I just sat there, watching as Diane's perfect world shattered around her. "This is insane." Diane shrieked, stumbling backward. "You can't do this. That money was mine. She wanted me to have it." One of the officers stepped forward, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Your mother's own statements, bank records, and legal documents say otherwise." If you'd like to argue your case, you can do it in court. Diane's face twisted in rage. She spun toward me, her eyes blazing. You did this, she spat. You set me up. I tilted my head, feigning innocence. No, Diane. You did this to yourself. The officer grabbed her wrist, snapping the cuffs around them with a final, satisfying click. Diane let out a strangled cry, thrashing as they dragged her toward the door. This isn't over, she screamed, her voice cracking. I'll fight this. I'll get a lawyer. But before she could finish, the officer shoved the door open, and she disappeared down the hall, her screams echoing behind her. Silence fell over the room. A silence so deep it was almost deafening. Then my uncle let out a slow exhale, shaking his head. Well, that was satisfying. My mother sniffled, wiping at her eyes, but there was no sadness. In her expression, only relief. I leaned back in my chair, letting the moment sink in. For years, Diane had manipulated, stolen, and controlled. She thought she was invincible. But now she had nothing. No money, no inheritance, no power. Just an orange jumpsuit and a cold prison cell waiting for her. And honestly, it was exactly what she deserved. With Diane hauled off to jail, I thought that was the end of it. That justice had finally been served. But then Mr. Calloway let out a sigh, flipping through one last folder. There's one more thing, he said. I turned, my stomach tightening. What now? He slid a document across the table. It looked old, yellowed at the edges, like it had been tucked away for decades. The words at the top made my blood run cold. Deed to property, transfer of ownership. My uncle leaned in, squinting. What the hell is this? Calloway folded his hands. This is proof that your grandmother never actually owned her house outright. A heavy silence fell over the room. What do you mean? My mother whispered, her voice barely audible. I mean, Calloway said grimly, that the house still legally belongs to the bank. I felt the world tilt beneath me. That house, the place where Grandma had raised her kids, where we'd spent every Christmas, every birthday, every family gathering, it wasn't really hers? But she paid off the mortgage, my uncle said, his voice sharp. Calloway nodded. Yes, but the deed was never officially transferred. She assumed ownership, but the paperwork was never finalized. The realization hit like a gut punch. Diane's fraud had been bad enough, but this meant that everything we'd just fought for could still be taken away. My mother clutched her chest. So, what happens now? Calloway sighed. We have two options. We can challenge it in court, dig through decades of paperwork, fight the bank for ownership. But that could take years, and there's no guarantee we'd win. I clenched my fist. And the second option? He looked at me carefully. You buy it back. My uncle let out a bitter laugh. With what money? Diane drained Grandma's savings. We don't have that kind of cash lying around. And then it hit me. I straightened, turning to my mother and uncle. Diane stole from Grandma. The police are charging her for financial exploitation. That means if she's convicted, we can go after her assets. My uncle's eyes widened. Holy, my mother blinked. You mean? I nodded, the pieces falling into place. We sue her. We take back every cent she stole. And if she spent it? Well, I smirked. She still has her house, her car, her jewelry, her retirement savings. Calloway nodded approvingly. That's correct. And from what I've seen, she was funneling quite a bit of money into her personal accounts. The plan was clear. Diane had spent years taking from us. Now we were going to take everything from her. Once Diane was convicted of fraud and elder abuse, we wasted no time. Our lawyers moved fast, filing a civil lawsuit to recover the stolen funds. The case was airtight, the bank records, the forged checks, the video will. Diane had no defense. She tried to fight it, of course. Even from prison, she screamed about how it was all a mistake. How Grandma had given her that money. The judge wasn't having it. Within 3 months, we won the lawsuit. Diane was ordered to pay back every cent she had stolen, plus damages. The problem? She didn't have the money. She had spent most of it on herself, luxury vacations, designer clothes, spa days, fancy handbags. Which meant one thing, Her assets were seized. Her house sold at auction. Her car repossessed. Her precious jewelry collection pawned off to the highest bidder. Her retirement savings drained to pay us back. Diane went from living in a big house, acting like she was better than everyone, to sleeping on a thin prison cot with nothing to her name. And honestly, it was poetic justice. But we weren't done yet. There was one last thing left: Diane's storage unit. Before going to prison, she had rented a storage space, stuffing it with things she thought she could hide from the courts. Designer bags, expensive shoes, personal documents, all of it locked away safe. Or so she thought. Because Diane, in all her arrogance, forgot one crucial thing. When you stop paying for a storage unit, it gets repossessed. And since my cousin happened to know the guy who managed the facility, we made sure her entire storage unit was sold at a public auction. To complete strangers, for dirt cheap. Every last bit of her hidden treasures was gone. And the best part? Since Diane was in prison, she didn't even know it had happened until it was too late. When she found out, she completely lost it. She tried to call us, screaming, threatening to sue us from behind bars. Which was hilarious considering she was broke. With the money from Diane's stolen assets, we bought back Grandma's house. The same house Diane had tried to steal. The day we signed the final papers, my mom cried. My uncle hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. We walked through the house, running our hands over the furniture, the walls, the kitchen counters, everything Grandma had loved. We had won. And Diane? She had nothing. No house. No car. No money. No family. She was completely alone. Months passed. Diane rotted in prison. We never spoke to her. Then one day I got a letter. No return address. I opened it and immediately recognized her handwriting. Pages and pages of rambling about how I had ruined her life. How it wasn't fair. How I had turned everyone against her. And at the very end, in big angry letters, she wrote, "I hope you're happy." I stared at those words for a long moment. Then I smiled. Because for the first time ever, I was the end.